Well, hello everyone. Yes, I am officially back now from my sabbatical, and I have to tell you, it was a wonderful time, and I am extremely grateful for this congregation and for the session and for the staff of this church for how they took care of things while I was away, giving me this wonderful opportunity to really travel and just see a tremendous amount of our world. I was in 7 countries. I slept in 25 different beds. I traveled over 15,000 miles. It was just a great time. And as you can imagine, there are lots of stories for me to tell. Now, some of those stories, yep, they may come out in these devotionals. Some of them are probably going to come out in some sermons. I plan on doing another presentation of some kind so you can see a portion of the nearly 7,000 pictures I took while I was away. But you know what? It's not just about that. It's about the stories and the experiences that happened along the way that made this such a wonderful time. You know, telling stories and hearing stories is so important. In fact, most of what we do in our life has to do with the telling and the experiences of stories. And our books are full of stories. The things that we tell to one another, those are full of stories. And you know what? We are encouraged in Scripture to tell stories of faith. In fact, it comes right at just a major central place within the Old Testament. It's in the midst of what's called the Shema, and that is this great challenge that is given to all God's people. And it says this, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 6. The Shema is this, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." But then it goes on and it says this, "Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home, when you are away, when you lie down, when you rise. Bind them as signs on your hand, fix them as emblems on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Do you hear that? How important the stories of faith are. And you know what? That really is what we do as a church. We tell stories that we find in Scripture, and we tell those stories of the men and women who experienced God that first time, and those are wonderful stories for us to tell. Our Sunday school, what we do in sermons, it's telling the stories of faith, those stories of Scripture. But you know what? As I was having this experience on this sabbatical, what I recognized and what I realized is it wasn't just about the stories that we find in Scripture that I think we're commanded to tell. We are also commanded to tell the stories of how we encounter God today. And you know what? I think that's what makes our faith alive. Is yes, these stories that are in Scripture, the stories of Jesus, the stories of those who follow Jesus, the stories of the Old Testament, of Moses, of the apostle, of the prophets, of all of those who experienced God that in those early moments of the faith. You know, those are all great stories to tell. They're wonderful stories to tell. But it's not just the stories in this book. It's how we encounter God in our everyday life. Those are the stories that need to tell. You know, I remember as a parent, sometimes we would sit with our kids and we would tell those Bible stories. You know, tell the story of Noah's Ark. We'd tell the story of David and Goliath. You know, we would tell those stories of our faith. We'd tell stories about Jesus and how he walked on the water and how he fed 5,000. We tell all those stories. But you know what I think sometimes I lacked? Is sitting down with my kids and just telling them stories about my experience with God, where I first came to faith, those times where I sat in quiet contemplation of who God was in my life, those times where I was struggling and how God's Spirit met me in the midst of that struggle, those times when I was just celebrating everything that God was doing in my life. I don't always tell those stories. And so that's the challenge. That's the challenge that I think I need to recognize, and perhaps you need to as well, that coming back from this sabbatical, yes, I've got all these stories to tell, and those stories leap out of my experience of walking through all that I did with the God who made this world around us, who gave us such a variety of culture and such a variety of images to see, such a variety within nature. You know, those are the stories too that make this faith come alive today. So, if you gotta listen to some of my stories, I hope you listen, and I hope there's something that comes out of those stories that do you well. But my biggest hope is that you find stories of your own, and that you don't keep them to yourself, but you find a way to share the faith and what God is doing in your life today. Who do you want to tell the story to? What story do you have that others need to hear?